Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings and welcome. I'm Joseph Sassoon, and I'm a professor of history and political economy at Georgetown Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. I am very pleased to welcome today to the event Archives, the Case of the 1860 Massacre in Syria. Um, Professor Eugene Rogan is at St. Antony's College. He's the director of the Middle East Center and the author of best-selling books, The Fall of the Ottomans, The Arabs in History, and his new one is The Damascus Events, the 1860 Massacre and the Making of the Modern Middle East. We'll have a presentation and we'll have a little bit of time for a Q&A after that. Thank you. Eugene, please go ahead.
Well, Joseph, first off, thank you so much for the invitation. I have deep love for your university, and my only regret is that instead of having the pleasure of being with you guys on campus, I'm doing this from my office here in Oxford. But next time, inshallah, I'll be doing it with you guys in Georgetown. So thanks. I'm delighted with the title of the talk. I like the idea of the case of the 1860 events. It makes it sound like either a mystery or a crime or a trial. And I think in some ways, any good history book would conform to any one of those descriptions. But what we're looking at today is the way in which a historian goes about the business of draining an archive or a library of the kind of resources it takes to say something new about a subject. And there's a good story behind the writing of this book, which made it kind of fun to talk about attacking the archives in the interest of writing history. So let me get started. You've had a chance to look at my book, and in reading the introduction, you'll have gotten the story about how I chanced on a treasure trove of documents written by America's first vice consul to Damascus, the first one to open an American diplomatic mission in Syria, or in Damascus, I should say. And that was Mikhail Mishaka. And, the story of the discovery is one of those things that I think any archival historian dreams of. The idea that you'll go to such a well-tapped source as, the United States National Archives and come across material that no one's ever read before. But of course, it's only happened because Mishaka's registers of his first, correspondence in his role as a vice consul for the USA were all kept in locally sourced notebooks, not the standard issue diplomatic registers that normal American diplomatic missions, even in the mid-19th century, used. They would move to those standard issue volumes in the 1870s in Damascus. And I imagine these first 3 volumes of Damascus reports were repatriated from the mission in Damascus, probably sometime in the mid-20th century, with an inventory. So the archivists in the National Archive knew that they had received the first 50 or 60 volumes of documents from Damascus. They were classified under Record Group 84, which are the records of consular archives, as opposed to the diplomatic dispatches of the State Department. And there they lay in pristine neglect from whenever they were first deposited until that day in January of 1989 when, cub reporter Eugene Rogan, just doing his archival duty for his doctoral dissertation, chanced on these volumes. They, as you know from the introduction, they couldn't find them. I kept calling up volumes 1 through 3, and the people in the reading room, frustrated, seeing that they hadn't been checked out, and there was no record that these volumes had gone missing or lost, suggested I make an appointment with the archivist, go into the stacks. This is before the archives moved to College Park. So this was still right down in central DC, off the mall, in that beautiful limestone building of the archives. And, what a treasure to be able to go into the stacks themselves, miles upon miles of very orderly volumes of amazing documents from all around the world where America's reach has taken diplomats. And Anyway, in taking down a little notebook in the stack of volumes around the Damascus Bay, I found glued on the front cover of one paper label written in Arabic that this was indeed the register of reports of the correspondence of the mission of Damascus from 1859 to 1865. Best discovery I've made in all my career as an archival historian, and it had to come right at the very beginning of my career as a Middle Eastern historian. And in a sense, I mean, I told myself from that moment on, though those reports proved of no value to my doctoral dissertation, that was going to be, a work on the Ottomans in Transjordan. Mishaka didn't have all that much to say about Transjordan, but I still photocopied every single page of those first 3 volumes, thinking, like any ambitious young scholar, that was going to be my next book. Get the thesis done, get it published, and for your tenure, you got to have your second book pretty much on the boil, if not done. And what a better project than to go from the sticks of Ottoman Transjordan, a place of very rural populations, Bedouin, cultivators, small towns, biggest population, 10,000, to the big city of Damascus, which was where, in at least late Ottoman terms, all the action was. So I was excited by that, but it took me a while. I had to finish that doctoral thesis, and that was done by 91, and I got my job here, moved to Oxford, wasted a lot of time. Guys, if I were ambitious in trying to get job on my publication record in a proper American university in the 90s on the basis of that record, I would be unemployed today. But happily, I got hired by Oxford, and they're very forgiving people, and they patiented me out. By 99, I got my thesis published and then turned to go to work on Damascus. And Damascus became a project that kept getting put off for reasons that I think I outlined in my introduction. Okay, why were the Mishaka reports so important? Well, the first thing was they were contemporary to events. Most of the sources we have on the Damascus events, that hair-raising massacre that led to the death of 5,000 Christians in the old city of Damascus in a week of unprecedented violence in the summer of 1860. Most of the reports we have were written as kind of chronicles in, let's say, 3 to 5 years after the events. They all benefited from hindsight. They knew how the story ended. They knew what the course of events would be, and they were all kind of politicized by the search for justice and remembrance that is common to the accounts that victims leave of their experiences of such violence. So these were all written by, for the most part, Christian eyewitnesses and survivors and victims. Mishaka, though himself a Christian, and he was caught up in the violence, his reports were contemporary to the events. So for the first time, we were able to do a deep dive into the Damascus before, during, and after the violence of 1860. And so nothing that he wrote was informed with the benefit of hindsight. And that allows for all the fears and doubts of the moment to come through with a granularity that was not captured by any of the many authors who have written about the 1860 events before me. In this sense, his sources were extraordinary. The other thing is Mishaka was himself a very prolific author, and he wrote a history of Syria and Lebanon that ends with his experiences of 1860. And so we had, in a sense, Mishaka's own narrative of those events with which to compare and contrast what he had written at the time in 1860 and afterwards. And I think it's a unique perspective to be able to compare and contrast one author's changing views on what he experienced. And his views did change between the reports he wrote as an American vice consul in the 1860s and his history of 1873, El-Jawab al-Iqtirah al-Ahbab. But more than that, what made discovering these papers so exciting for me was they were written by Mikhail Mishaka. Mishaka was himself such a known quantity. He really emerges from mid-19th century Damascus as such a three-dimensional character. He, as I've said, very prolific author. He stands out as a man of the Nahda, this period of an intellectual renaissance that was just taking off in the 1860s and 70s in Ottoman Syria and Lebanon. So wrote tracts, religious tracts, philosophical tracts, a study of music, a study of mathematics, as well as his own history. So, a very prolific author. He was a convert to Protestantism. That linked into a whole series of networks familiar to anyone who's worked in the papers of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions held at Harvard. And these are the Presbyterian missionaries sent from the United States, set up, very influential missions right across Lebanon and Syria, very important in providing, educational institutions, schools. They'll give rise to the Syrian Protestant College that becomes the American University of Beirut. And Mishaka is very closely connected to all of these missionaries and to other people in the Nahda, such as Bustani, who's clarion of Syria, one of the sort of essential fundamental texts emerging from the 1860 horrors to set a new agenda for citizenship in Syria. So Boutros el-Bustani, encyclopedist, great man of the Nahda, worked very closely with Mishaka because Bustani was the head of the translation bureau for the American consulate in Beirut. He received all of Mishaka's reports and translated them into English for the benefit of the American consulate in Beirut. We even have a photographic portrait, several actually, of Mishaka by the famous French photographic studio Bonfils in Beirut. So what an amazing guide for us today to that strange and forbidding and amazing world of mid-19th century Damascus. The other thing is that I was excited by finding these documents because it kind of plays into something that I feel is essential to the way that we as Westerners, I mean, I'm speaking as an American who teaches at a British university, I'm speaking now to you in Georgetown. So how we as Westerners, Americans, Europeans, whatever, go about a study of a region in which we are foreigners with respect for the views and traditions of the people that we are studying. And in that, really, I would say that what has been the common thread in my last 3 books, The Arabs of History, The Fall of the Ottomans, and now The Damascus Events, has been this attempt to try and tell the history of the Middle East, of the Arab world, through local sources. The idea being my value added, because I learned Arabic and Ottoman Turkish, is that I can access sources that average readers cannot, and then I can then relate the story of this fascinating region through Arab eyes or through Ottoman eyes by relying on their sources. This is very much my approach in writing the Arabs. I really limited myself to diaries, memoirs, manuscript sources by Arab authors, men and women, across the last 5 centuries to try and write a history that was in many ways inspired by Amin Maalouf's amazing history of the Crusades. I don't know if any of you had the chance to read this, but his book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, was translated and published in English in 1985. Maalouf is still a very active author. And in that, he draws on the Arabic manuscript tradition to try and give the Arab perspective on the Crusades, which I found just, completely blew the lid off the study of knights in shining armor and made me totally rethink my understanding of both the Crusaders themselves, what an unwashed, crude bunch of, backwards Europeans they were, confronting the refinement of the Islamic world and Jerusalem, and what a enlightened and intelligent group of people the Muslims of Palestine and Greater Syria were confronting the Crusader hordes. I really liked the approach that he took, and I felt like it gave me a whole new insight into understanding that medieval history. And the same is true, in looking at the fall of the Ottomans, where I guess there the agenda was to try and approach the battlefields of the Great War in the Middle East from both sides of the trenches. I wasn't trying to do just a history of Arabs and Turks in the First World War. I also wanted to get at the experience of Britain's Commonwealth soldiers, the French and their colonial soldiers, relying on letters, diaries, memoirs, photographic evidence to try and capture, what the war was lived like on both sides of the trenches. And for that, being able to tap into as wide a range of perspectives and as a plurality of voices And then you find that there's so many commonalities that come out of the war experience, whether it's the way that Ottoman Turks or Arabs, as much as the British or the French, took to poetry to try and capture the extraordinary experience of industrial scale warfare that they experienced with no preparation, who had preparation for the First World War after all, to, their experiences of life in the trenches, which is just not so different if you're on the British or Entente side or on the Ottoman or Triple Alliance side. So, this attempt to try and get the plurality of voices to tell that history. And I guess when I come to the 1860 book, I was faced with different challenges. I had an incredible voice in Mishaka and his reports. And while he's a dream source, we have to acknowledge no book should be written on the basis of one voice. You would not want one person to characterize so complex a history as I tried to tell in the Damascus Events. There are a number of biases that you can immediately attribute to Mishaka. On the one hand, he was a Christian, caught up in a massacre of Christians. He was himself very, very severely injured in the massacre, separated from his family, who, by the grace of God, survived the violence, all members of the family, quite remarkable that they did so. So, the fact that he was a Christian, that he was himself caught up in the violence, and that he makes many claims that, you really would want independent confirmation for. You wouldn't want to take it on his word alone. He has a whole conspiracy theory about the complicity of Ottoman officials in bringing on the massacre in the first place, which may or may not be true. And I try to explore the role that Ottoman neglect or indeed Ottoman connivance might have in some way been behind the deterioration of civil order in Damascus that might give rise to such horrific events. But the fact of the matter is, just like any journalist, you would want independent confirmation of any scoop. You wouldn't take it on one source alone. Doesn't work in journalism, doesn't work in history writing. But the other thing to say is, my reading of the history reveals Damascus to be a city far too complex, far too rich, far too diverse to leave just to one voice. You would really want to try and find a plurality of voices that would allow you to capture the many dimensions of that incredible city. And, thinking about an example that might be close to all of you, dear listeners, sitting as you do in Washington, D.C. But can you imagine 150 years from now, having just one democratic source on which to base your narrative of the inauguration of Trump's second term and what lay behind it and what you imagine will come from it? You'd want to have a whole range of voices, ranging from MAGA Republicans through, I don't know, the bishop who presided over yesterday's service, Bishop Butte, but you wouldn't want just one source. And so I should say is the case when approaching a city as rich and diverse as Damascus. And what a foreign land it is to us today, 160 years later. You really have to appreciate that there's just so many parts of that city that we would find shocking and surprising and would need more than one guide to. So in the years since I first came across the Massacre reports way back in 1989, I've been scouring archives and libraries to try and diversify the voices to tell the story of the Damascus events. This took me to Istanbul, where I went to what was then the Başbakanlık archives. They were down in the Sultan Ahmed area, not too far from the Blue Mosque. Just such a wonderful place to work. Every historian in our field would spend every summer there. It's been since relocated. I haven't visited the new site. It's been renamed. It's now the Devlet Arşivleri Başkanlığı, Osmanlı Arşivi, or the Ottoman State Archives. But there I was able to spend a fantastic summer going through the irade files, so the imperial rescript files, for the full collection of reports that were being filed by state officials in the lead up to, during, and after the Damascus events. And of course, this is where I was able to lay hold of a vast trove of reports written by Fuad Pasha. I've got him on my desk here. He's been sort of keeping me company as I have been on my journey to tell the story of the Damascus events. As those of you who've read through parts of the book know, Fuad was the foreign minister of the Ottoman Empire, great statesman of the Tanzimat. He was dispatched by the Sultan as minister plenipotentiary to solve the problems of Mount Lebanon and Damascus after the massacres in those two lands in the summer of 1860. He is without doubt the architect of the reconstruction of both Mount Lebanon and Damascus. His role in containing the threat that the European powers posed to Ottoman control in Mount Lebanon and Damascus really stands out. And there were two threats. There was the French army, 6,000 strong, headed by a man which, even in my most balanced and judicious opinion, comes across like a raving lunatic when you read his reports, for his vision of leading his soldiers to glory by drawing blood of the villainous Muslims and Druze responsible for killing the Christians. De Beaufort was definitely a ticking time bomb, and I think that Fuad Pasha emerges as the bomb disposal unit in that case. The other, of course, is the International Commission. That was Europe's other way of trying to intervene in the disorder in Mount Lebanon and Damascus. A series of commissioners sent by the great European powers, the British, the French, the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, all to go and assist the Ottoman government in the process of identifying who was responsible and punishing them for the violence done to the Christians, finding mechanisms for reimbursing the Christians for their losses and restoring them to their homes, and then a reorganization of the governance of the territory so that there would never be a repeat of the violence of 1860. Here again, one can see where there's almost a kind of a precursor to that modern notion of the responsibility to protect, that UN inscribed notion of states intervening to protect minorities when their governments or actors within the country are not constrained from doing violence to minorities. You could see already Europeans were thinking in these sort of responsibility to protect, to justify interventions. But then, as now, just be wary of the intentions of great powers who seek to intervene on humanitarian grounds, because I would argue in the 19th century, there was always a whiff of imperialism behind the motives driving the Europeans in their interventions. Fuad emerges from the pages of the book as really one of the heroes of this story. And I think that his success in diffusing European threats, containing the damage they stood to make, really stands out as an extraordinary accomplishment by one of the leading statesmen of mid-19th century Ottoman Empire. So having his reports was absolutely essential for getting a kind of Ottoman state perspective on what unfolded in Damascus and its aftermath. But there were absences too, and I think absences in the archive are also very telling. The one who is most evasive, and I really regret not having a better bead on this character, is Ahmed Pasha, the governor of Damascus, who was at the helm as the city declined into mass murder. And his role has been a mystery to his contemporaries, as it is to historians who've come to the subject. We have a biography from him in Bitar's biographical dictionary of influential Syrians, but Bitar's biography, which runs to 10 or 12 pages, very flowery language, tells you almost nothing about the man. I don't know where he was born. I don't know from the source, who he married, who his children were. I know very little about the course of his career before Damascus. I know that Bitar extolled his virtues as a Muslim and a governor, so running very contrary to many of the Christian writers who saw in Ahmed Pasha the agent of their undoing, the man who directly or by omission was responsible for the deterioration of security to the point of a massacre. and Mishaka would count himself among those who held Ahmed Pasha responsible. I only found one report drafted by Ahmed Pasha after the Damascus events. And that one report was telling for how delusional he was in trying to dismiss the gravity of what was taking place. It was written about 3 days into the violence. There was still another 4 or 5 days of violence to go at the time of his drafting that report. And he tried to present it as something that was reasonable to explain and would soon be under control. And I think that the record of the subsequent trial of Ahmed Pasha and his execution for his crimes would suggest that there was a great deal more to the story than he revealed in his own reports. So I'm going to count Ahmed Pasha as an absence. And I've been writing his part of the story almost in palimpsest, reading the impressions left on documents by others, but having very little in his own hand. So Istanbul was a rich source for writing this book. So too was Damascus. And I went to Damascus, as I recount in the introduction. My work started in the Islamic court records, preserved in the Markaz al-Wathaiq al-Tarikhiyya in Souk Sarouja in downtown Damascus. They have a very rich collection of the Sharia court records, where you will find scattered among the different cases, certain cases that relate to either those who were victims of the violence or damage to property in the violence, or indeed those who were themselves punished for their roles in the violence. And this was a source that Abdul Karim Rafiq drew on, looking at inventories of those who were executed for their involvement in the Damascus events, policemen and aghawat, or the militia leaders from Damascus, to try and give his account for what might have been behind the participation of some of the security forces in the events themselves. So in addition to those sources, I was also delighted to discover that the family of Muhammad Sa'id al-Ustuwani finally published the diary that al-Ustuwani had kept. Al-Ustuwani, of course, was the khatib, or the preacher, the Friday mosque preacher of the celebrated Umayyad Mosque, the most famous and the largest of Damascus's ancient mosques. And it's a quirky document. You know, it's a treasure to anyone who is looking for one of the leading Muslim notables to walk you through the complexities of the city of Damascus. He tells all kinds of funny stories that just have no rhyme or reason other than they struck him as interesting, or they revealed something about people or government in Damascus. And he started in 1840. He wrote right through the early 1860s before it tapered off. And so al-Ustuwani was, a wonderful Muslim voice contemporary to the events, who had wonderful insights into the perspective of the Muslim notability of the city. And I found that absolutely essential to balance out what otherwise is a plethora of Christian survivors' accounts. There is a second such Muslim notable whose memoirs were published in the 1960s. This is, of course, Muhammad Abu Saud al-Hasibi. Al-Hasibi, who would later become the Naqib al-Ashraf, or the leader of the guild of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. He was, in 1860, a young Sharif himself. He was arrested by the authorities on the suspicion of having participated in the violence himself. He leaves us with an account of the events that's largely written from the perspective of jail, where he was incarcerated immediately after the events and spent just over a year. So here again, we have another Muslim notable account, but a different generation, younger than al-Ustuwani. And his Qunnash, or his notebook, preserved in the Zahiriya library, moved to the Asad library in Damascus. I understand its whereabouts are now in question. I don't know whether the manuscript itself is still available in the Zahiriya library or the Asad library, but happily, the doyen of Lebanese historians, Kamal Salibi, published almost all of the Qunnash, this scrapbook, in 3 installments in the American University of Beirut journal El Abhath back in the 1960s. And for those of you who don't want to read through the detailed Arabic, there is a delightful article that gives you kind of the best of El-Hasibi's comments on 1860 by Kamal Salibi in that famous collection written or edited by Polk and Chambers called The Beginnings of Modernization in the Middle East in the 19th Century, which came out in 1968. But Hasibi and Ostawani were really essential to balance out the Christian voices that predominate and give you Damascene Muslim perspectives on the unfolding of events, and they were absolutely brilliant for that. I went to Beirut to work in the library of the American University of Beirut. The Jaffet Library holds a very rich collection of many of the Christian manuscript sources on which much of the prevailing historiography of the 1860 events has been based on until now. These are, again, absolutely essential sources. They're all anonymous. We can speculate on who might have been behind them. Perhaps the authors were concerned about the possibility of retribution. They wanted to be able to write with a candor that putting their names to the manuscripts inhibited. I'm only speculating. But the ones that stood out for me were the Tanahudat Suriya, or the Sighs of Syria, the Kitab al-Ahzan, or the Book of Sorrows, and of course Mishaka's own 1873 masterpiece, Al-Jawab al-Iqtirah al-Ahbab, or the response to the suggestion of the loved ones, which is his history of Syria and Lebanon in the 18th and 19th century, which he wrote in 1873. So these manuscript sources, again, are so valuable for capturing Christian eyewitness and lived experiences of the Damascus events. But, not the only basis on which you'd want to write this account if you were to try and come at the three-dimensional history that this rich city of Damascus deserved. There's one last character that emerged from all the above, and that's going to be the Emir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. Abdul Qadir will be familiar to all of you who have studied the history of the French occupation of Algeria. He was to emerge as the commander leading the Algerian resistance to the French occupation starting in 1832, and led 10 or 11 years of combat against the French until his ultimate capture by the French and imprisonment, released in 1855 by Louis Napoleon, later to be Napoleon III. He was pardoned for defending his own territory against imperialism, very generous, and exiled. The rules that the French laid down was that he was never to take up arms against France again, and he was never to return to his native Algeria, but that, short of that, he was free to go anywhere in the world he so wished. And he started by going to Bursa, near Istanbul in Ottoman Turkey, but he felt himself a stranger in a Turkish-speaking land and wanted to go to an Arabic-speaking land, and chose Damascus, where he went in 1855, and was received among the notables of Damascus as a celebrity, as a hero. He very quickly achieved notable status in his own right, and the Jazairi family, so the descendants of Amir Abdul Qadir, will be recognized as one of the notable families. They're the most recent addition to an otherwise ancient group of leading families of the city of Damascus. He was himself, before taking up arms against France, a Sufi. He was a scholar. He imagined for himself a career as an alim rather than as a freedom fighter. So when he got to Damascus, what he wanted to do more than anything else was fall in with the ulama and the scholars. He was drawn into teaching in the Umayyad Mosque. He was a frequent visitor to the mausoleum of, I hate it when in the middle of a talk a name fails to come to me. The Sufi mystic who was buried in Salahiyah outside of Damascus. It'll come to me in a second. And he was settling into a life of some leisure, some luxury on a French stipend. And he really emerges in the course of years as very devoted and loyal to Napoleon III, very loyal to France. And so this is incredible conversion of Abdul Qadir from leader of the insurgency to something of a French agent. And his position allows him to not only establish his household in Damascus, but to attract 12 to 1,300 Algerian veterans who did not wish to live under French rule in Algeria. They too come and settle in Damascus. And as the security situation begins to deteriorate in Damascus, Abdul Qadir gets the support of the French consul in Damascus to arm his veterans of the Algerian insurgency and create something of an Algerian militia. These men under arms were the only effective force to intervene during the Damascus events to try and rescue Christians besieged in the Christian quarters and take them to safety. And it's not overcrediting Abdul Qadir to say he was responsible for a very large share of the 85% or so of the Christians of Damascus who, against all the odds, actually survived the massacre. So, we can really credit Abdul Qadir with this. Certainly the international community did. He was given medals and awards and recognition by every power on the globe and their aunt, including the Ottomans themselves. The British, interestingly enough, didn't give him a medal. Queen Victoria sent him a letter of thanks and congratulations, and that was considered, reward enough for his efforts. Abraham Lincoln sent him a pair of pistols by way of thanks, which is a very odd thank you from an American president. But I guess given our Second Amendment's fascination with guns, maybe that was the right gift from an American president to the Algerian leader. Abdul Qadir was a very prolific letter writer. And so his letters in his very distinctive Maghribi script are to be found in British archives, French archives, the Ottoman archives. And I just kept gathering every single letter I could get to try and write him into the story in his own words. So he emerges as well as one of my main voices in telling of the story. So, the end result, it's almost embarrassing to say that it's taken me 35 years since my excitement in finding those Mishaka documents to actually sit down and write the damn book. This is academic procrastination taken to extraordinary and ridiculous lengths. But I'm very glad I waited this long. I feel like I had the freedom to really go about writing a very different sort of book than I might have written, say, 20 years ago. And it gave me the time and luxury to really get that plurality of voices that allowed me to approach the Damascus events from not just Mikhail Mishaka's, and he certainly stands out as the dominant voice in my narrative, but from those Muslim notables of Damascus, from those who represented the Ottoman state, from the insider-outsider like Mishaka. And what results, I think, is the richest cast of characters of any of the books that I've ever written. And the fun thing about the Damascus events is they stay with you as active voices in the book throughout most of the book. Those of you who read the conclusion know that I basically bury them when I get to the conclusion. And I think in that sense, it really feels almost more like a story. And in that, maybe my most literary book so far, certainly the one, given the grim story it tells of the decline of society into genocidal violence, very, very hard story to tell, but the one I think I've had the most pleasure in writing. So let me stop there. I understand we've got a lot of questions, and I'll let you set the agenda from here on. Joseph, back to you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it and fascinating. Before I start with the student questions, I'm just curious. Did Mishaka's ancestors stay in Syria after World War I?
So Mishaka's family are an interesting bunch, and I've never been in touch with them. I've just had email correspondence with one from Montreal, Canada, who was delighted to see the book come out and the attention being brought to his great-great-grandfather. But also this year, and I'm going to highlight this to any of you who are interested in Mishaka himself, but our colleague Peter Hill, who did his doctorate here in Oxford, his second book is Prophet of Reason, and this is an intellectual biography of Mikhail Mishaka. He doesn't mention Mishaka in the title, Science, Religion, and the Origins of the Modern Middle East, but it's a wonderful intellectual biography that will fill you in on many of the other aspects of Mishaka life than his political life. And for that, he actually got in touch with surviving members of the Mishaka family, many of whom were based in the United States. But they do stay through World War I. He passes the role of vice consul to his son, Nassif. Nassif stays in until 1914. And it's sometime in the aftermath of 1914 that his descendants begin to migrate to elsewhere in the world. I'm hoping, now that I've made contact with this Mishaka in Montreal, that I will get a chance to meet with more of them. And I envy Peter the exchanges he's had. And I benefited from his book because Mishaka, like so many of the men of his age, really did not go into any of the details about the women in his family. So I really only learned about his wife, her name, how young she was when Mishaka married her, by reading Peter's work. And I recommend it to all of you. It's all part of what makes Mishaka such a three-dimensional character, that we could actually have an intellectual biography of the guy of this, rich quality.
One question is that both you and Albert Harani talk about the events as watershed moment that contributed to the formation of modern Lebanon and Syria. How do you think it is still shaping the memory of the event? And to what extent do modern Lebanese and Syrian ideologies reflect some or reframe the legacy? And a similar question is, what was the impact on regions outside Syria and Lebanon, such as Palestine? What is the reaction at the time for the massacre?
Very briefly on the latter half, because 1860 was a summer in which Christians in many parts of Bilad al-Sham, or Greater Syria, were being seen by the Muslim majority as a kind of existential threat. And so there was the risk of mass violence against Christians in Palestine at this time. It didn't happen. As it turned out, there was intervention by the authorities to prevent it. And there were rumors going wild at the time of the Damascus events of massive Christian uprisings targeting Muslims at prayer, during Eid al-Adha celebrations, during Friday prayers, in Homs and Jerusalem. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. If the rumors were spreading, people were responding to rumors that were fact. And in a sense, we're fortunate that the violence did not spread more widely, but really it was to be, in 1860, just Mount Lebanon and Damascus. But the legacy of this, it's funny because, as you will know from your own books, Joseph, I have a different publisher in Britain than in the United States. And in the United States, they've called the book The Damascus Events, the 1860 Massacre, and the Making of the Modern Middle East. And the British edition, Damascus Events, the Christian Massacre, and the End of the Old Ottoman World. And the Brits were like, well, it's anachronistic to talk about the modern Middle East around 1860. And the Americans were like, American readers aren't so into the old Ottoman world. That won't mean much to readers. In a sense, both are true. And what I would say, it's the reconstruction rather than the events themselves that's going to spell the confirmation of a new order in the Ottoman Empire that presages citizenship over subjecthood. Before these events, before the Tanzimat reforms of 1856, it gave Muslims, Christians, and Jews legal equality. We were really still dealing with an Ottoman Empire in which Sunni Muslims were dominant, and in which the minority communities, Christians, Jews, and others, were respected and protected, but distinctly second-class citizens or subjects. And where there was a great deal of self-governance within these communities, raising their own taxes and submitting them, through communal heads, or having personal status laws that were particular to their own religious community. And this gives way to everyone living under the same Ottoman law and all paying the same taxes to the same tax collectors, regardless of your religion. the measures that follow 1860 and are very instrumental in the reconstruction of Damascus will bring rational government to Ottoman provinces, including representative government at all levels of the Ottoman administration. So cities would be ruled by municipalities, and those municipalities had councils. Each council had members that were elected. And any Ottoman, regardless of their religion, could stand for office. There was quota system. So it would be a certain number of Muslims, certain number of Christians, certain number of Jewish or Druze or different communities depending on the setting. But this idea of running for office or voting for representatives, these are notions of citizenship that are leaving the old Ottoman system behind and are anticipating the 20th century with the development of states. And the difference I draw between Reconstruction in Damascus and what happens in Mount Lebanon is that in Mount Lebanon, you have a new political order that enshrines sectarianism as an instrument of government. So there's a distribution of office according to one's religious community. It starts in the aftermath of 1860 under the Mutasarrafiyya, which is the new Ottoman system of government, a governorate in which an Ottoman Christian not native to Mount Lebanon would be appointed as governor of Mount Lebanon and would preside over a council that had the seats of the council allocated to different religious communities, more or less proportionately to their numbers in Mount Lebanon. So that will be picked up by the French, who create a confessional order, sectarian order in Mount Lebanon under the Mandate, in Greater Lebanon. And even when the Lebanese make their bid for independence and try and craft a new political order outside the French Mandate, the 1943 National Pact in Lebanon still stipulated that the president of Lebanon be a Maronite Christian and the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and right through the panoply of religious communities. That's Lebanon. And that's why 1860 shapes a very distinct political Lebanon that remains a problem, if I could say, down to the present day. You know, how do you deconfessionalize politics in Lebanon and make Lebanon a state of its citizens? Damascus was different. There was no sectarian legacy in the reconstruction of Damascus. And if you like, the political culture of Syria, in its nationalism, in its independence, in its Arab nationalism, Damascus would be the birthplace of the Arab Ba'ath Party. You know better than I, Joseph. And the two founders of that movement, you know, Michel Aflaq, an Orthodox Christian, you know, Salahuddin Bitar, Sunni Muslim. And to them, Muslim, Christian, you're all Arab. It is the Arab identity which trumps everything else. And so, you know, the sectarian divide of Lebanon was not the culture of Syria. And this notion of a citizenship that is ethnic as Arab, in which religion is not a defining feature, has been what has enabled, let us say, an Alawi domination of Syrian politics under the Assads down to the present day. You know, the hope is that with the fall of the Assads and the rise to power of a Salafi movement like the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, will be able to preserve this secular culture that has been Syria's Ottoman legacy since the reconstruction of 1860, as I have tried to portray it in this book. Its roots go back to Ottoman times, but it has been preserved right through the Mandate, through independence. And were Syria to be spared a kind of confessional order or a Islamist-dominated politics that subordinates those who are not Sunni Muslims, and there are many in Syria, the Alawis, the Druze, the Shia, the Christian communities, the very, very small Jewish community. You know, a state of its citizens, if preserved, would be preserving an Ottoman legacy that we can date back here. And in that sense, you know, the making of the modern Middle East.
And you quote al-Maqdisi, Osama, about this also, how important it was to make Syria, you know, as long as you're an Arab, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jew, you felt part of the country.
Yeah, exactly.
There are a couple of questions on the archives, the physicality of your research and the experience you gained in Damascus. There is also one about what, given the fact that it took you more than 30 years, how would have your style have changed had you
Yeah.
written that book at the time? And one other thing which is a little bit different is, um, given what you just spoke, when writing histories of events that happened over 150 years ago, how do we navigate contemporary fields of politicization? And how do we approach sources that might support the very framing we're trying to challenge?
Yeah, there's such good questions. And you've given me too many for me to make sure I juggle them. But let me start with the physicality of archival work. And I mean, I don't know your experiences, Joseph. I mean, a lot of the material you made your name in was actually repatriated back to the US, but I'm assuming you've had a chance to go and tap into some of the archives in Iraq since then. I don't know. But I mean, for me, part of the fun of being an archival historian has been the travel that lay behind it. You know, I loved going to Beirut, Damascus, Istanbul for these research trips, sitting down in the archive, having the original documents literally brought out and put in front of you, and in touching the pages written by the contemporaries, you feel as though you get this physical contact with the history you're writing about. I don't want to mysticize this, but I always find it very moving. I mean, even when I laid hold of Mishaka's volumes the first time and realizing that since they'd been repatriated from Damascus to Washington, no one had touched them. I mean, I don't know if anybody read those since Mishaka himself, but I know he read them. I know he used them as reference when he went to write his own history of the events. I can see certain phrases that are common between the Joab and the reports that he wrote. I know he used them as a source. It was just like, this virtual handshake, I think is the word I used in explaining it in the book. But I feel that stuff. And so the physicality, the travel to the cities, being in Damascus, I've always loved the city. I'm dying to go back. It's so exciting to know that with the fall of the Assads, there may be a genuine end to the civil war in Syria and a reconstruction that means that we're not validating a brutal dictator by going to this country. So, inshallah, we get the chance to return to the city as scholars and historians and to engage with Syrians, and not just the archive, but when the archives closed, I'd walk the city streets. I'd go around the neighborhoods where this stuff took place. I wanted to see with my own eyes. What's the width of the streets in which the riots took place? What would it feel like, the claustrophobia of being trapped in that moment? Where did Abdul Qadir live? Where did Mishaka live? Being able to walk the streets, pull your boots on and walk on your history. This is part of the fun of our work as historians. And I love it. So the physicality of actually chasing after the documents, going to the archives, sitting down with the papers themselves. I mean, my great regret about the move of the Ottoman archives from the Sultan Ahmed area to its new site and the new facility, look, it's a very good archive, and they serve researchers in many ways better than the old one did. But everything's delivered to you digitally now. You no longer call up the original folders and papers. And you look at the catalogs, I'm told, you call up the files you want to look at, it's all been scanned, you're directed to a screen, you're given a CD-ROM, and then stuff you want to copy, you have to make a special request to get copied and all. I miss the paper. I like handling the physical object. And in that sense, holding the same paper that Fuad Pasha held as he wrote his report. I love that shit. So yeah, the physicality is a big part of it. The second question you asked me, Joseph,
The politicization.
I think that's the third one.
Okay, sorry, no, the second one was about how did your style change in those 30
Oh,
years?
that's so interesting. I mean, if I'd written this immediately after my first book, I published with Cambridge, and it's a monograph. It was written for scholars. If it sold 1,000 copies, I'm proud. I don't even know if it's done that. Um, Already then, I liked telling stories. There's an element of storytelling to my way of approaching the history of Ottoman Transjordan. I think I would have brought some element of that to this book, but at some point, um, after 9/11, I decided that I wanted to try and write for a general public. And my last three books were written as much for the general reader as they are for scholars. I mean, I care very much about how my books are received by my colleagues in the academy and by students. So I'm definitely writing for an academic audience, and these are intensely researched books, and the last two very archivally researched books. But my style of writing changed to be able to communicate more directly to non-specialists. And so my hope in writing the Arabs and those books that have followed was that these would be books that would be written in a voice interesting enough to tempt a non-specialist reader to like read the book. And in that way, the politics behind writing the Arabs was to try and combat, let us say, Arab and Islamic hostile books written after 9/11. Bernard Lewis kind of nailed the discourse with his, What Went Wrong book. And there were many who shared his worldview that, Islam and politics and the backwardness of the Middle East and resentment against the advances of Europe and the United States was fueling a kind of Islamic fury. And there were a lot of books that picked up that line of analysis. Bernard Lewis was a brilliant historian and a wise old man, but I disagreed with a lot of the things he wrote. And I felt like we who were dominant in Mesa were absent in, let's say, the popular bookshelf, the airport bookshelf. We were leaving that ground to many people who were writing in the know thy enemy vein of Middle Eastern studies. And it was important to try and write a book that would engage that broader readership. And that got me going with the Arabs. And to be honest, it's really fun writing for that broader readership. You reach a much bigger audience. If I sold 1,000 copies of the fall of the, of the Frontiers of the State, my first book, between all the different languages, it's got to be several 100,000 copies of the Arabs that are out there. It's in 18 languages. It's just like it's a totally different experience. People read the book. And, so the fall of the Ottomans, I tried to, build on the same readership for the Arabs. And, the Damascus Events is not selling in the same numbers as the last two, but the reception's been just fabulous. And I think that for people who have actually read the book, the feedback I'm getting is they're finding it just a really good read. And so word of mouth is, keeping the book active. And I'm hopeful that it's going to continue to find its audience. But definitely my way of writing has changed. And I don't think I'm going back, guys. I mean, the idea of trying to go back to a kind of theoretically informed, scholarly piece of work, I'm coming up closer to retirement than I am towards tenure. And I'm writing what I want to write now. And I'm finding that voice much more fun to write in. And in the end, it's the fun of writing these books that motivates me to get on with the next one. So that's the voice one. And then the third is engaging with the politicization today. Is that? Yeah, look, part of the fun of reading the Arabic sources from the time is that you're not always sure that you understand what they're saying. And it's not just because I'm American and my Arabic is not as good as the native speakers. That is certainly true. But as I read through the footnotes of someone like a master historian like Kamal Salibi, reading through the Kunash of El-Hasibi, there were just things that he said that you weren't quite sure because it was the slang or the local vernacular of Damascus of the mid-19th century. And those things might seem like a wall, but I always feel like they're a window. That in trying to engage with those bits where you have to really try and use other sources to read them against, you kind of unlock what might be something particular to that moment. And in this way, I think those 19th century sources can protect you from making assumptions about the Damascus of then with the Arab world of now. And so they can help us not to be, if you like, loading agendas and baggages of today's world on 1860s Damascus. Trust me, they had enough baggage of their own. And it's enough to try and unpick what their worldview was, what animated them, what their hopes were, what drove them. And this is where having such different, in many cases, really quirky voices. I mean, just one, thinking of Al-Ustuwani, I think it might be one of the chapters I recommend you guys read, but he just tells the story of the day that he led a service in the Umayyad Mosque to pray for rain, which already sounded like, something so Native American, praying for rain. And it's actually not uncommon in many societies in the early modern, pre-modern Middle East. But the fun part came afterwards because, okay, he describes all the people who were at this service, and then a bunch of young guys who were all from, the notable elites, all retired to one of their houses, and they spent the whole night making rude cracks and jokes about all the establishment figures in Damascus. And they gave them all really unflattering nicknames. And they were so pleased with themselves that as dawn rose, they went out and told all and sundry about how funny they'd been. And of course, it's a small town, Damascus, and word gets back to the very officials who were being slagged off by these rude young men. And, the governor wasn't amused, and he had them all thrown in jail. And, that kind of story and how it played out, and, what was considered a joke, what was funny, what wasn't, how the authorities reacted, what was pushing authority, those to me are like such precious windows in trying to understand that very different world. We're all foreigners there. Saying somebody's chin looks like a zucchini will not strike you and me today as being particularly rude. Making a comparison between someone's laugh and a donkey's bray would go down badly even today. But, I love this stuff. And our sources allow us to do that and remind you constantly. Or Mishaka having a slave. I mean, I found that utterly shocking. What was a Christian notable of Damascus, a convert to Protestantism, a representative of the disunited states of America at the time of the American Civil War, which was in no small part about slavery, and the guy is suing for the value of his slave who was abducted from his household. What a strange world that was. So I think that the sources I was using allowed me to recognize just how different the city of Damascus in 1860s was from the world today, and protected me from trying to impose political agendas backwards. But I always see the value in writing this history through, its present relevance. And I've just written a new preface for the book because I've gotten two unanticipated plugs from events that have happened since the book was published in May. And the first was in October. Thank you, Pope Francis. I'm speaking to a Jesuit college, so you guys will appreciate this. But he just canonized 11 Christians killed in the Damascus event. 3 Maronites and 8 Franciscan missionaries or friars in the convent of Terra Santa. They're known as the Damascus martyrs, but, for making the case that people are still concerned and talking about these events. And then the second, of course, was the fall of the Assad regime, and this whole debate about what the future governance of Syria will be and the place of minorities in that, now that precisely the kind of Salafi movement that the Christians of Syria, not just Damascus, most feared might come to power. And here we have Tahrir al-Sham in power and trying to reassure Syrians and the international community of their intentions to recognize the equality of citizenship of all Syrians, regardless of their religion, and targeting the Christians in particular. And just saying, in doing so, he is upholding an Ottoman secularism that has been a legacy of Syrian politics down to the present. So, I am guilty of trying to backwards project today's politics onto what happened then to try and demonstrate it is still relevant to talk about the 1860 events. But mea culpa. We all do what we can to flog our books, Joseph.
One question is about the final report of Mishika, where you talk about it, and you mentioned from a pragmatic point of view that he suddenly says the Ottomans are not to be blamed. What do you think? Can you talk a little bit more about it? Because the change was really dramatic.
Change is very dramatic. And it's actually after he has retired from his job as vice consul, and it's his assessment at the end of his history, Al-Jawab al-Iqtirah al-Ahbab, And I wrote an article about this. It was published in Arabica. It was sort of one of my earlier outputs to show that I really was going to do something with this material. And I was just struck by the difference in tone. His first report, which he wrote in 1816, and the thing about Mishaka, he was very severely injured during the attacks. He describes it at some length. He was bludgeoned in the eye, which swelled over, and he lost vision in that eye for weeks afterwards. He got it back. And he raised an arm to try and fend off blows with a sword and suffered very bad wounds to his arm that kind of made it hard for him to write. So it took him a while to get back to actually writing stuff down. He relied on his son Latif to draft some of his reports. But when he finally got around to writing about this stuff, it was the massacre was in July, and I think his first full report comes out in September. Check the date on that. And at that point, he just despairs of there being a future for Christians in Damascus after what's happened. He doesn't trust the Ottomans, and he believes that the only thing that's going to preserve the Syrians is going to be a foreign intervention. And so he writes a report that says basically, we Christians in Damascus, we Christians in Syria more broadly, have always been seen as, disposable. We're people not accepted by the mainstream of the Muslim population here. And we have had historic periods in which they have really persecuted us. And he goes right back to Umar ibn Khattab and the Crusades after that, the Napoleonic invasion. He tracks his whole history of the moments in which the Christians, by association, have been the target of reprisal or hatred. And 1860 is just the latest, and it demonstrates just how genocidal, he didn't use those words, or exterminationist, Sunni antagonisms to Syrian Christians were. And that the foreign world had to intervene or the Christians would be wiped out. And it makes sense that he was giving that message because he'd yet to see the Ottomans resolve the problems. The Christian quarters were still in utter devastation. There were still dead bodies in the rubble of the ruined Christian quarters of Bab Tuma, Bab Shar'i. And, there was a lot of ground to be covered before he'd begin to see the Ottomans making effective change to redress the situation. There was an international commission at work. So Mishaka's trying to influence the Americans to lean on the British, the French, the others, to try and make a solution that would protect the Christians of Syria, probably a foreign intervention of some sort. And there was also a French army in town. So, it made sense that he was playing to the European presence in the region and the influence of Americans to try and effect some change that would protect Christians from any further violence. Footnote, of course, the Americans had no influence. And one of the fun things about reading this history is realizing what a small and unimportant country the United States of America were in the 1860s Mediterranean world. The Ottomans really never saw the Americans as a force to take seriously. And the fact that the Americans would dissolve shortly after these events into civil war themselves meant that it was a fractious and divided country that was essentially of no relevance or influence in Mediterranean or Ottoman affairs. So, Mishaka was hoping that the Americans might be able to lean on the British in their efforts. The Brits were, after all, heavyweights here. But that was his first report in 1860. By 1873, what a different Damascus Mishaka is inhabiting. The Christian quarters have all been rebuilt. That task was completed by the end of 1864. It was shoddy. It was poor. It wasn't the same standard of houses that Christians lived in at the time of the events in 1860, but it was roofs over heads that, as people regained their economic life and built up their own wealth, were able to make into nicer homes until by the 1870s, 1880s, people were once again living in lovely homes. And the Ottomans were established as the ruling power of Damascus. There was no question of a foreign intervention to protect them again. And if you were going to live in this new Ottoman age of citizenship, of full equal rights, of participatory politics in the municipal and the provincial level, then you had to throw your lot in behind the Ottomans, and there was no longer any room for Christian separatist shenanigans. You just had to recognize that if you wanted to prosper and thrive in this Ottoman order, then you had to be a totally obedient and loyal Ottoman subject. And that was the future. There would be no European knight on horseback that would come to the rescue of the Christians of Syria. They would have to make their bed and sleep in the Ottoman Empire. That was the future. And that's the tone in which he wrote in 1873, which to me is all about the politics of our sources in their own writing of history. You know, our sources are complex people, and they evolve over time. And we see that in the sharpest tone between 1860 and 1873.
One last question before we end. Someone asked whether you could briefly talk about the work of Kamal Salibi, specifically the Bible came from Arabia.
Oh, that's so interesting. And I read The Bible Came from Arabia, thinking that it was an exercise in systematic doubt, but that it wasn't a serious attempt to try and resituate the Bible away from Jerusalem and Palestine. And Kamal Salibi was no stranger to the Oxford community. He was a frequent visitor here. He was kind of a leading figure of the Center for Lebanese Studies while we had one in Oxford in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s. And I remember sitting down with him and saying, so Kamal, really intriguing, but you don't actually believe it. And he did. He was not just doing a polemic to try and challenge our biblical certainties or question Zionist claims to a biblical homeland for the Jewish people being based in Palestine. He really thought that the geographical and the toponymical clues would lead us to situate the Bible in Arabia rather than in Palestine. I mean, there may have been behind that a certain degree of him doing it for provoking the controversy, but he insisted to me that he was sincere in his belief that it was worth considering. That the case was still out with the jury, and I don't know. Do you have a view on that one, Joseph? Did you read the book?
No, I have not.
It's a curious work. He's such an erudite scholar, and he's able to draw on such a wide range of sources, geographical and historical. But I'm still going to think that next year in Jerusalem was not talking about, El Ola or Hejaz or Neom. We are where we are.
Well, all that is left is really to thank you on behalf of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies for this wonderful talk and your patience in answering all the questions. And I think overall, everyone who read the book loved it. And
Thank you.
maybe you'll find another archive for the next one, which I know
I'm at work. We're trying to get the Arab and the Ottoman sources on the Arab revolt in the Hejaz during World War I. So watch this space. There's another book coming.
Good. Thank you very much, Eugene. Much appreciated, really.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you all, audience. Good night.
Good night.